The chandeliers of the Grand Astoria ballroom dripped light, a crystalline rain that fell upon a sea of tailored tuxedos and silk gowns. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and ambition, hummed with the polite murmur of 1,000 conversations, each a delicate negotiation of status and influence. This was the suffocating opulence of Marcus Thorne's world, a world where charity was a currency and compassion was a performance. Elias Vance stood near the edge of the stage, a silent island in the glittering ocean of New York's elite. He felt the weight of their collective gaze, a pressure as tangible as a hand on his shoulder. He was an architect, a builder of tangible things, community centers that smelled of fresh paint and hope, affordable housing that echoed with the laughter of children. But tonight, he was an abstraction, a symbol. He was the recipient of the Thorne Foundation's Architect of Tomorrow Award, a humanitarian honor that was supposed to be the capstone of his career. His suit, a simple, dark wool, felt like an apology in this room of extravagant peacocking. He observed the room not with awe, but with the quiet, strategic intensity of a man assessing structural integrity. He noted the load-bearing columns disguised by floral arrangements, the flow of human traffic between the bar and the silent auction tables, the way the acoustics amplified whispers into weapons. He was out of his element, a man of sawdust and blueprints, adrift in a world of champagne and subterfuge. "He's quite the story, isn't he?" a woman whispered behind him, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Pulled himself up from nothing, the South Bronx, I hear." Elias's posture remained unchanged, a disciplined economy of movement that betrayed a past he never spoke of. He didn't need to turn to know who they were. They were the vultures of society, circling anything that smelled of authenticity, ready to consume it for their own narrative. The master of ceremonies, a television personality with a blindingly white smile, was wrapping up his introduction. A man whose vision is matched only by his heart. He doesn't just build structures, he builds communities. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome this year's recipient, the truly inspirational Elias Vance. A wave of polite, percussive applause washed over him as he walked toward the lectern. The stage lights felt like interrogations lamps. He caught a glimpse of Marcus Thorne in the front row, seated on a throne-like chair, his handsome face arranged in a mask of benevolent approval. Thorne was a titan of the tech world, a self-made billionaire whose philanthropic endeavors were as famous as his revolutionary software. He was the sun around which this entire solar system of wealth and power revolved. Elias reached the podium, the smooth wood cool beneath his fingertips. He looked out at the blur of faces, the glittering diamonds, the expectant smiles. He cleared his throat, preparing to deliver the modest, grateful speech he had practiced. "Thank you," he began, his voice calm and steady. "I am deeply humbled." He never got to finish. "If I may," a voice, smooth as silk and amplified by the ballroom's sound system, cut through his words. Marcus Thorne was on his feet, gliding toward the stage with the predatory grace of a panther. A deferential stagehand rushed to offer him a microphone. The applause faltered, replaced by a ripple of confused murmurs. Thorne smiled, a disarming, charismatic gesture that put the room at ease, even as it set every nerve in Elias's body on edge. "Forgive my interruption," Thorne said, his voice a warm, reasonable baritone that filled every corner of the room. "Elias, please, stay. This concerns you." He turned to the audience, his expression one of sober sincerity. "Tonight, we are here to celebrate vision, integrity, and community. The Thorne Foundation is built on these principles. And in the spirit of that, in the spirit of absolute, unwavering integrity, We believe in total transparency for our donors." A knot of ice formed in Elias's stomach. He stood frozen at the podium, a spectator at his own execution. Thorne continued, his tone becoming graver. "It has recently come to my attention that there are certain discrepancies in the financial records of the Vance Architectural Foundation, the very foundation through which Elias does his incredible community work." Gasps rippled through the ballroom. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a rising tide of accusation. Camera flashes, once celebratory, now felt like muzzle flashes in a firing squad. Elias could feel hundreds of eyes dissecting him, rebranding him from saint to sinner in the space of a heartbeat. "Now, I want to be perfectly clear," Thorne said, raising a placating hand. "I am not making any accusations. Not at all. I have the utmost respect for Mr. Vance and the work he has done." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air, thick and poisonous. "However, to protect the trust our donors have placed in us, I have no choice but to announce a full, independent, and immediate audit of his foundation's finances. I'm sure Mr. Vance welcomes this opportunity to clear up any potential clerical errors and reaffirm the trust we all have in him." It was a masterclass in polite destruction. Thorne had not called him a thief. He had simply built the gallows, handed Elias the noose, and smiled benevolently as the crowd kicked away the stool. As the camera flashes intensified, the blinding white light triggered something deep within Elias. The opulent ballroom dissolved. The scent of perfume and champagne replaced by the smell of chalk dust and fear. He was 10 years old again, standing in the principal's office of his crumbling elementary school in the South Bronx. A broken window, a stolen wallet, and the accusing finger of a boy whose father was a cop. He did it. The boy had lied, his eyes glinting with casual cruelty. "I saw him." Elias had stood there, just as he was standing now, silent and powerless. He had no alibi, no one to speak for him. His father worked 2 jobs, and his mother was sick. He was just a quiet, smart kid from the projects, an easy target. He remembered the principal's weary, dismissive gaze, the prejudged verdict in his eyes. He had been found guilty before he could even speak. The shame had been a physical thing, a hot, suffocating blanket that had stayed with him for years. The memory snapped back into the present. He was no longer a helpless 10-year-old boy. He was a man who had built a life, a reputation, a legacy on a foundation of integrity. And another man was trying to tear it all down with a few well-chosen words. He looked at Thorne, who was still holding the microphone, his face a perfect portrait of reluctant duty. And in that moment, Elias saw past the philanthropic mask, past the charismatic smile, and recognized the same casual, confident cruelty he had seen in the eyes of the boy in the principal's office. The audience expected him to stammer, to deny, to crumble. But the boy who had been powerless was gone. In his place stood a man who had learned to channel his rage into a disciplined, unbreakable calm. Elias's expression didn't change. He simply stood there, his posture erect, his gaze locked on Thorne. He took a slow, deliberate breath, and his reaction was so unnaturally composed, so devoid of the expected panic, that a new kind of suspense fell over the room. They had come to see a coronation, witnessed an execution, and were now confronted with a resurrection. The whispers died down, replaced by an unnerving silence. Who was this man? Really? What was he capable of? Elias gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to Thorne. It was not a gesture of defeat. It was an acknowledgement, a declaration. The battle had been joined. The days that followed were a systematic demolition of his life. The world that had celebrated him now shunned him. The air in his own office, once filled with the optimistic scent of sawdust, blueprints, and brewing coffee, now felt stale with fear. The warm, collaborative energy of his studio, Vance and Associates, had been replaced by the hushed, sterile tension of a law office awaiting a verdict. Phones rang with cancellations, not commissions, clients, who had once praised his community-focused vision, now spoke of fiduciary responsibility and reputational risk. Elias moved through the wreckage with a disciplined calm that unnerved his partners. While they panicked, he analyzed. While they despaired, he planned. He saw the cascading consequences of Thorne's attack not as a personal tragedy, but as a complex structural problem that needed to be dismantled, piece by piece. The contrast between his world and Thorne's had never been starker. Thorne inhabited a universe of cold, gleaming surfaces, glass-walled boardrooms, where fortunes were decided in hushed tones, minimalist penthouses with panoramic views of a city he owned but did not touch, private jets that sliced through the clouds, sterile and detached from the world below. His power was abstract, built on algorithms and market fluctuations. Elias's world was tactile, authentic. He found solace in the grain of a freshly sanded piece of oak, the rough texture of a concrete sample, the genuine smiles of the residents in the neighborhoods he'd revitalized. He knew the names of the foremen on his construction sites, the local bakery owner who brought pastries to the groundbreaking ceremonies, the kids who played in the parks he designed. This was the world Thorne was trying to take from him, and the philosophical chasm between them was absolute. 2 weeks after the gala, a formal summons arrived. Marcus Thorne had requested a meeting, not in a neutral location, but at the headquarters of Thorne Industries, a glittering spire of steel and glass that pierced the Manhattan skyline like a declaration of war. Elias walked into the lobby, and the sheer scale of the place was designed to intimidate. A 4-story atrium, walls of polished black marble, a silent, monolithic waterfall cascading into a shallow pool. The air was chilled to a precise temperature, carrying the faint, clean scent of ozone and money. He was escorted to the top floor by a silent assistant. The elevator ascended with a silent, frictionless hum, a vertical journey into the heart of his enemy's empire. Thorne's office was less a workspace and more a temple to power. An entire wall was a single pane of glass, offering a god's-eye view of the city. The furniture was sparse, sculptural, and impossibly expensive. Thorne himself stood by the window, silhouetted against the sky, a modern-day emperor surveying his domain. "Elias," Thorne said, turning. His smile was as polished and impenetrable as the marble in the lobby. "Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." Elias remained standing. "I prefer to—" Thorne's smile didn't waver. He gestured to a leather chair. "As you wish. I wanted to speak with you personally, to express my regret that all of this has become so public." "You orchestrated its publicity, Marcus," Elias said. His voice was even, devoid of accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "A necessary evil, I'm afraid." Thorne sighed, leaning against his massive desk. "The Foundation's integrity is paramount. You understand?" He picked up a small sculpted object from his desk, turning it over in his hands. "I truly hope this is all just a misunderstanding, a series of unfortunate clerical errors. It would be a shame for a man of your background to have his good work undone so carelessly." The insult was delivered with surgical precision. Your background. The boy from the Bronx. The charity case. The man who didn't belong in these hallowed halls. It was meant to unbalance him, to remind him of his place. Elias's gaze remained steady. He didn't take the bait. Instead, He asked a question, a quiet, surgical question that cut through the layers of feigned concern. Marcus, your newfound concern for clerical accuracy is admirable. I assume you'll be applying this same level of intense public scrutiny to your own foundation's offshore accounts in the Caymans. For the first time, a flicker of something other than perfect composure crossed Thorne's face. It was gone in an instant. But Elias saw it. Surprise. Annoyance. My foundation's finances are perfectly in order, Thorne said, his voice a fraction of a degree colder. I'm sure they are, Elias replied smoothly. Just as mine are. The difference is, you've weaponized an audit to destroy my reputation before a single ledger has been opened. Why? Thorne laughed, a soft, condescending sound. Don't be paranoid. Elias, this isn't personal. It's just due diligence. A formality. A formality that has cost me every major contract my firm had. Elias stated, a formality that has branded me a thief in the press. A formality that has undone 20 years of work in 2 weeks. That doesn't feel like due diligence. It feels like a targeted demolition. Thorne set the object down and walked closer. His personal space invasion, a classic power move. He lowered his voice. Let me give you some advice. Elias, the world isn't a blueprint. It's not neat and orderly. Sometimes, things just collapse. The wise man accepts it and walks away. The foolish one tries to shore up the ruins and gets crushed in the process. Walk away. Let the audit run its course. Disappear for a while. In a year, no one will even remember your name. It was a threat wrapped in the guise of friendly advice. The message was clear: stay down, or I will crush you completely. Elias met his gaze without flinching. I don't walk away from my buildings, Marcus, and I don't walk away from this. He turned and walked toward the door. Thank you for your concern. As he left the office, Elias knew that the inciting incident was over. The first shot had been fired at the gala. But this conversation was the declaration of war. Thorne hadn't just attacked his reputation, he had revealed the personal, malicious nature of his crusade. This was not about money. It was about annihilation. And, as the elevator descended back to the real world, Elias Vance, the builder, began to draw up a new set of blueprints, not for a community center, but for the methodical deconstruction of Marcus Thorne. The first blow landed not from the outside, but from within. Elias was summoned to an emergency meeting of the board of his own foundation, the Vance Architectural Foundation. The boardroom, usually a place of shared vision and collaborative energy, was thick with a funereal gloom. The long mahogany table felt like a coffin. Seated around it were the men and women who had championed his work for years, people he considered friends. Today, their faces were a mixture of pity, fear, and betrayal. At the head of the table sat Arthur Gable, a retired banker with a spine made of jello and a keen sense of which way the wind of public opinion was blowing. He refused to meet Elias's eye, focusing instead on shuffling a stack of papers. Only one person looked at him directly: David Chen, his oldest friend, a corporate lawyer with a fierce intellect and an even fiercer sense of loyalty. David had been the best man at Elias's wedding and the godfather to his daughter. His expression was a mask of grim support. Elias, Arthur began, his voice wavering, in light of the ongoing investigation initiated by the Thorne Foundation and the significant negative press, the board has had to consider its fiduciary duties. What you mean, Arthur? David cut in, his voice sharp. Is that Marcus Thorne called each of you personally and threatened to pull his funding from your other More lucrative charities if you didn't fall in line. A few board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Arthur's face flushed. That's an unfair characterization. David, we have a duty to our donors. Your duty is to the truth, Elias said quietly, his voice commanding the room's attention. And the truth is, there is no missing money. This is a fabrication. A malicious attack by Thorne. We hope that's the case. Elias, truly. We do, said another board member. A woman who had wept with joy at the opening of his last project, a shelter for homeless families. But the optics are terrible. We're losing donors by the hour. We have to take decisive action to restore confidence. Decisive action, Elias asked, a dangerous calm settling over him. And what does that look like? Arthur cleared his throat, finally looking up. The board has voted to suspend you as director, pending the outcome of the audit. He couldn't hold Elias's gaze and looked back down at his papers. It's a temporary measure. Of course. The vote had been 7-1. David was the lone dissenter. The betrayal was staggering. These were the people who knew him, who had seen his dedication firsthand. Yet, at the first sign of trouble, swayed by the influence of Thorne's money, they had cut him loose. It was an institutional obstacle, a wall of cowardice and self-preservation he could never hope to breach through official channels. The meeting at his architectural firm was even worse. His two partners, men he had built the company with from a single drafting table in a rented garage, were openly panicking. The conference room was littered with spreadsheets projecting catastrophic losses. Elias, the Kensington project just pulled out, said his partner. Frank, that's a $60 million contract. They cited the moral turpitude clause in our agreement. The city is reconsidering our bid for the downtown library renovation, added his other partner. Maria, the council is getting nervous. We're radioactive. We have to do something, Frank pleaded. Issue a statement. Hire a crisis PR firm. A statement denying something I didn't do will only make me look guiltier. Elias said, and no PR firm can fight a lie of this magnitude when it's being bankrolled by a billionaire. He looked at his partners, at their terrified faces, and realized they were already calculating their exit strategies. They were good people, but they were not warriors. They would not stand with him in a protracted war. He was utterly, completely alone. The cascading consequences were overwhelming. His reputation was in ashes. His foundation had cast him out, and his firm was on the verge of collapse. The official channel's lawyers, accountants, PR were like trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose. Thorne had built a prison of public opinion around him, and the walls were closing in. That night, Elias sat in his studio, the one place that still felt like his own. The smell of cedar and graphite was a small comfort. Spread across his drafting table were not blueprints for a new building, but a blank sheet of paper. The first obstacle had shown him the futility of defense. He couldn't rebuild his own reputation while the saboteur was still at work. He had to change the battlefield. He picked up a pencil. He wasn't designing a building anymore. He was designing a war. He made 3 phone calls. The first was to David Chen, his loyal friend from the board. David, he said, I'm not going to defend. I'm going to attack. I need you to handle the legal firewall. Keep the firm from imploding completely while I work. Whatever you need. Elias, I'm with you. David replied without hesitation, his voice a balm on Elias's frayed nerves. The second call was to a young, fiercely intelligent junior architect at his firm named Lena Petrova. She was a digital native, a tech prodigy who could see the architecture of code as clearly as Elias saw the structure of a building. "Lena," he said, "I have a special project for you. Off the books. It's about data analysis. Deep data." "I'm in," she said, her voice electric with curiosity and loyalty. She had grown up in one of the community housing projects Elias had designed years ago. Her allegiance was not to the firm, but to him. The third call was the hardest. It was to a name he hadn't spoken in over a decade. Sullivan, a grizzled, semi-retired investigative journalist who had once written a scathing, brilliant exposé on corruption in the city's construction industry. Sullivan was a bloodhound, a man who lived in a world of shadows, sources, and secrets. He had a healthy distrust of the wealthy and powerful, and a nose for the truth that was second to none. "Vance." Sullivan's gravelly voice answered after 3 rings. "I thought you'd gone respectable." "They're trying to take it all away, Sully." Elias said. "I read the papers. Marcus Thorne. Big fish." "I'm not asking you to prove my innocence," Elias said. "I'm asking you to find out who Marcus Thorne really is. Everything. Where he came from. How he made his first dollar. Who he stepped on to get to the top. I need his blueprint." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then a dry chuckle. "This sounds like it's going to be fun. I'll send you my rate. And Vance, welcome back to the mud." With his small, loyal team in place, the rising action began. Elias transformed his studio into a war room. The walls, once covered in sketches of hopeful urban landscapes, were now plastered with network diagrams, financial charts, and corporate structures, all centered around the smiling, public face of Marcus Thorne. Lena worked tirelessly, her fingers flying across multiple keyboards. She was the digital ghost, slipping through firewalls and encrypted servers, mapping Thorne's vast empire. She wasn't a hacker in the traditional sense. She was a data archaeologist, piecing together publicly available information, Shell Corporation filings, and forgotten digital footprints into a coherent mosaic of Thorne's operations. Meanwhile, Sullivan hit the streets. He worked his network of old sources, disgruntled ex-employees, bitter rivals, forgotten city clerks. He was searching for the cracks in Thorne's carefully constructed public biography. The official story was that Thorne was a tech prodigy from a comfortable suburban family in Connecticut who had built his empire from his dorm room. A week into the investigation, Sullivan called Elias. "Got something?" He grunted. "It's weird. Thorne's official bio is watertight. Too watertight. It's like it was manufactured. But I dug into old census records, school archives, before he was Marcus Thorne, the boy genius from Greenwich. He was Mark Thornton, from the South Bronx." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. The same neighborhood, the same dirt-poor streets he had clawed his way out of. "He erased it," Elias said, the pieces beginning to click into place. "He completely erased his past." "Wiped it clean," Sullivan confirmed. "Changed his name legally at 18, the day he got a scholarship to MIT. There's almost no record of his family. It's like they never existed. This isn't just a man hiding humble beginnings. Elias, this is a man hiding a ghost." The detail was unsettling, a piece that didn't fit the puzzle. For now. Elias filed it away. Their first move had to be precise, strategic, and, most importantly, true to his own character. He would not stoop to Thorne's level of fabricating lies. He would use the truth. Lena found the vulnerability. It was buried in the financials of one of Thorne's most celebrated charitable projects, the Phoenix Initiative, publicly. It was a massive urban renewal project designed to revitalize a low-income neighborhood in Brooklyn. Thorne had received glowing press for his generosity. But Lena's data analysis revealed a different story. "It's a sham, Elias," she said, pointing to a complex flowchart on her screen. "Thorne's foundation isn't just funding the project through a series of shell corporations. He's also the primary real estate developer. He's using the charitable initiative to drive down property values, buying up entire blocks for pennies on the dollar through proxies. Then, the Renewal Project comes in, gentrifies the area, and his property values skyrocket. He's not helping the community. He's displacing them for profit and getting a tax write-off for it." It was a brilliant, predatory scheme, disguised as philanthropy. "Can you prove it?" Elias asked. Lena smiled. "I've got the full paper trail. The shell corporations all trace back to a holding company registered in Delaware, which is owned by a trust. The trustee, Marcus Thorne's personal lawyer. This was the weapon. It was perfect. Attacking the Phoenix Initiative wasn't just an attack on Thorne's finances. It was an attack on his carefully crafted image as a benevolent savior. It would reestablish Elias's reputation as a genuine community advocate while casting the first real shadow of doubt on Thorne. Elias didn't leak the story to a major newspaper. That would be too obvious. Instead, he gave the entire file to a small, fiercely independent online journalism outlet known for its relentless investigative work. He included a detailed architect's analysis of the project, showing how the zoning changes and development plans were designed for maximum profit, not community benefit. The story dropped on a Tuesday morning. The headline was explosive: Marcus Thorne's Phoenix Initiative, Philanthropy or Predatory Real Estate Grab. Canada. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The story, backed by Lena's irrefutable data and Elias's expert analysis, went viral. Community groups in Brooklyn erupted in protest. City council members, who had lauded Thorne as a hero, now scrambled to distance themselves. The narrative had shifted. For the first time since the gala, Marcus Thorne was on the defensive. Elias felt a grim satisfaction. He had landed the first clean blow. He had used his own skills, his meticulous attention to detail, his understanding of urban planning to expose the rot at the heart of Thorne's empire. He had proven that his own world of tangible truth could fight back against Thorne's world of abstract lies. But he knew this was only the beginning. A wounded predator is the most dangerous kind, and Thorne's retaliation, he suspected, would be swift, vicious, and deeply personal. Thorne's response came a week later, and it was more brutal than Elias could have imagined. It wasn't an attack on his business or his foundation. It was an attack on his soul. A prominent online tabloid, a publication known for its character assassinations, published a front-page story with the headline, "The Shameful Secret of Saint Elias Vance." The article contained a scanned copy of a sealed juvenile record. It was from 25 years ago, when Elias was 15. The charge was arson. The document was heavily manipulated. Context was stripped away. Key details omitted. The story it told was of a troubled, violent teenager from the Bronx who had set fire to a derelict warehouse. There was no mention that the warehouse was a known drug den, a blight on the neighborhood. No mention that Elias and his friends had been trying to scare away the dealers who were preying on the local kids. No mention that the fire had been an accident, a flare gun that had gone off unexpectedly. And most importantly, no mention that all charges had been dropped when the community rallied behind him, testifying to his character. The leak was designed to emotionally cripple him. It was a direct strike at the core of his identity. The narrative he had built his life upon, the good man who had escaped the ghetto through hard work and integrity. Thorne was recasting him as the thug who just learned to wear a nice suit. It was a confirmation of the lie whispered at the gala, "A man of your background." The fallout was immediate. The faint whispers of support he had begun to hear after exposing the Phoenix Initiative died down. His partners looked at him with new, suspicious eyes. Even the warmth in David Chen's voice was strained when he called. "Elias, why didn't you ever tell me about this?" David asked, the hurt and confusion clear in his tone. "Because it was nothing." "David," Elias said, his voice weary, "it was a stupid mistake I made as a kid. The records were sealed. It was supposed to be forgotten." "It's not forgotten now," David said grimly. "It's on the front page of every gossip site on the internet." Elias spent that night alone in his studio, the glaring headline of the article burning on his laptop screen. Thorne's strategy was clear: to isolate him, to make his own allies doubt him, to drown him in the shame of his past. He felt the old, familiar suffocation of the principal's office, the powerlessness of being falsely defined by others. For a few hours, he let the despair wash over him. Thorne had found his oldest wound and had poured salt in it. He felt the urge to retreat, to surrender, to fulfill Thorne's prophecy, and just disappear. But as the first light of dawn crept through the studio windows, something shifted within him. He looked at the headline again, at the twisted, malicious version of his past, and he realized the absurdity of it all. He had spent his entire adult life running from that scared 15-year-old boy, terrified that someone would expose him. He had built his reputation as a fortress to keep that part of him hidden. And now, the worst had happened. His deepest shame was public knowledge. The world knew his secret. And he was still here. The building hadn't collapsed. The world hadn't ended. The leak, intended to be his prison, became his liberation. Thorne thought shame was his greatest weakness, but he was wrong. It was his greatest fear. And by forcing him to face it publicly, Thorne had inadvertently stripped him of it. The fear was gone, burned away in the crucible of public humiliation. There was nothing left to expose, nothing left to hide. He was no longer a man defending a reputation. He was free. His resolve hardened into something cold, pure, and unbreakable. His mission was no longer about clearing his name. It was about justice, a primal, absolute justice. His methods, which had been strategic and defensive, now became bolder, more direct. The blueprints on his war room wall were no longer about deconstruction. They were about demolition. He called Sullivan. "I want to know about the fire." "Sully," he said, his voice devoid of its earlier weariness, replaced by a chilling focus. "What fire?" Sullivan asked. "The one Mark Thornton ran from," Elias said. "The ghost he's been hiding from his whole life. Find it." Sullivan, the old bloodhound, went back to work, digging deeper into the erased history of Mark Thornton. He spent weeks in dusty city archives, chasing down faded property records, cross-referencing old newspapers on microfiche. The work was slow, painstaking. Meanwhile, Elias and Lena escalated their own offensive, feeding information to regulators about Thorne's anti-competitive practices, creating a steady drumbeat of negative press that chipped away at his corporate armor. But Elias knew the real answer. The key to the entire war lay in Thorne's past. The call from Sullivan came late one night. "I found it," Sullivan said, his voice grim. "It's worse than we thought." Elias listened, his hand gripping the edge of his drafting table as the story unfolded. 35 years ago, a catastrophic fire had swept through a tenement building in the South Bronx. It was a 5-story brick walk-up, home to 24 families. 8 people died, including a mother and her 2 young children. The family's name was Thornton, Marcus Thorne's mother and siblings. The cause of the fire was ruled accidental. Sullivan continued, his voice heavy. But the death toll was blamed on a faulty fire escape on the 5th floor. It collapsed when the family tried to use it. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. "Go on." The city inspector who had signed off on the building's safety certificate just 2 months before the fire. His name was on the report. "It was your father, Elias." The words hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back, leaning against the wall for support. His father, a kind, meticulous man who had taken immense pride in his work as a city building inspector, a man who had taught Elias the sacred responsibility of building things that kept people safe. The idea that he could have been responsible for the deaths of 8 people, for the tragedy that had defined Marcus Thorne's life, was inconceivable. Thorne's vendetta was no longer a mystery. It wasn't about business or power. It was pure, distilled revenge. 35 years in the making. Thorne believed Elias's father had killed his family, and he was now systematically destroying the son's life in retribution. This was the second obstacle, and it was a moral labyrinth. His enemy was not a simple villain lusting for power. He was a man twisted into a monster by a grief so profound it had poisoned his entire existence. How could he continue his war against a man who saw him as the heir to such an unforgivable sin? "There's more," Sullivan said, his voice dropping lower. "I was looking into Thorne's current charitable donations, the real ones, not the sham projects. He's been anonymously funneling millions of dollars into a private research clinic in Switzerland. They specialize in experimental gene therapies for a rare, aggressive form of leukemia." "Who's the patient?" Elias asked, his throat dry. "Took some digging, but I found her," Sullivan said. "His younger sister, Sarah Thornton. She wasn't in the building that night. She was staying with an aunt. She's his only living relative. And Elias, she's dying." The revelation landed with devastating weight. Thorne's ruthless ambition, his insatiable drive for wealth and power. It wasn't just for a high score. It was a desperate, frantic race against time to save the last piece of his family. The monster had a motive, and it was love. Elias hung up the phone, the silence of his studio pressing in on him. His mission, once so clear, was now hopelessly complicated. He was fighting a man who was himself a victim, a man driven by the most human of impulses, grief and desperation. The blueprints for demolition felt wrong, crude. The path to justice was no longer a straight line. It was a tangled, thorny path through a shared history of tragedy. And Elias didn't know if he could walk it without destroying what was left of his own humanity. The final battlefield was chosen by Thorne. It was to be his coronation, the ultimate display of his power and benevolence, the global, live-streamed Thorne Summit, where he would unveil his legacy project, Prometheus, a global philanthropic AI initiative designed to solve everything from climate change to world hunger. It was the apex of his public narrative, the moment he would be cemented in history, not as a mere billionaire, but as a savior. The event was held in a custom-built pavilion in the heart of the city, a cathedral of glass and light, filled with world leaders, tech visionaries, and a global press contingent. A week before the summit, an engraved invitation arrived at Elias's studio. He was being invited not just to attend, but to join Thorne on stage. The accompanying note was a masterpiece of condescending magnanimity. "Elias," it read, "in the spirit of healing and moving forward, I want to give you a public forum to put these unfortunate misunderstandings behind us. Let us show the world that progress is more important than personal grievances." It was a trap, the final, public humiliation. Thorne, believing he had won, wanted to forgive Elias on the world stage, a final act of dominance that would cast Elias as the penitent sinner and Thorne as the benevolent god. David and Lena urged him not to go. "It's a setup, Elias," Lena warned. "He'll destroy you." "I know," Elias said, a strange calm settling over him. "That's why I have to be there." Sullivan had made one last trip to the city's municipal archives, a cavernous, forgotten basement where paper records went to die. He had a hunch, a reporter's instinct that the official story of the fire was too neat. After days of searching through mountains of decaying paper, he found it a misfiled folder, buried in a box of unrelated zoning variances. It was the original inspector's report for the tenement building. His father's report. Elias walked into the Thorn Summit Pavilion, a ghost at the feast. He moved through the glittering crowd, invisible in his simple dark suit. He ignored the whispers, the pointed fingers, the looks of pity and scorn. His focus was singular, absolute. The moment came. Thorn, having delivered a soaring, messianic speech about the future of humanity, paused dramatically. "And now," he announced, his voice resonating with false grace, "I want to do something that is very important to me. I want to bring a man to the stage who has been a friend, and recently, a rival. A man I believe has been misunderstood. Please welcome, Elias Vance." A spotlight found Elias in the crowd. The massive screens on either side of the stage showed his face, calm and unreadable. A wave of murmurs swept through the auditorium. He walked toward the stage, each step deliberate, measured. He didn't look like a defeated man being led to his final disgrace. He looked like a man walking toward his destiny. He reached the stage and shook Thorn's offered hand. Thorn's grip was firm, patronizing. He leaned in and whispered, for Elias's ears only, "It's over. Just smile and take it." Thorn guided him to the center stage lectern. "Elias," he said into the microphone, "the floor is yours." Elias calmly approached the microphone. The world was watching. He didn't look at the audience. He looked directly at Marcus Thorn. "Thank you, Marcus," he began, his voice steady and clear, amplified to fill the vast space and broadcast to millions around the globe. "You've spoken tonight about truth, about using technology to build a better future. I believe in those things, too. But the future cannot be built on a foundation of lies." A nervous tension filled the room. This was not the speech of a penitent man. "You've all heard the stories about me," Elias continued, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "About my foundation, my past. Marcus has presented a narrative to you. Today, I'm here to present the facts." On the massive screens behind him, a document appeared. It was the deed to the Brooklyn properties, showing the clear link between Thorn's shell corporations and his real estate grab. Lena, from a remote location, was controlling the presentation. Elias, methodically, calmly, presented the irrefutable proof of Thorn's financial crimes, the predatory nature of the Phoenix Initiative. Thorn's smile tightened. His eyes were cold slits of fury. He motioned to security, but it was too late. Elias had hijacked the narrative. "But this was never about money," Elias said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal, more intense. "This was about something that happened 35 years ago. A fire. A tenement building in the South Bronx." On the screens, a grainy, black and white photo of the burned-out building appeared. A gasp went through the crowd. Thorn looked as if he had been struck by lightning, his face ashen. 8 people died in that fire," Elias said, his voice thick with an emotion he had suppressed for decades, "including the mother and siblings of a young boy named Mark Thornton, a boy who grew up to become Marcus Thorn." He turned to face Thorn directly. You have spent your entire life believing a lie. You believed my father, a city inspector, was responsible for the deaths of your family. Thorne was trembling with rage. Your father signed off on that death trap. He killed them. No, Elias said, his voice cutting through Thorne's fury. He didn't. On the screen, a new document appeared. It was the original inspector's report Sullivan had found, scanned in high resolution. The lettering was faded, but the words were clear. Elias's father's meticulous handwriting was visible to the world. And, at the bottom of the page, in big, block letters, was a single, damning word condemned. Below it was a list of dozens of violations, including a specific citation for a structurally unsound fire escape. My father condemned that building, Elias announced, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. He ordered it to be vacated. He did his job. He paused, then delivered the final, devastating blow. But the safety approval that the landlord used to keep his tenants in that building was a forgery. And the landlord, the man who owned that tenement, the man who forged that document to save a few $1,000s on repairs, was your own uncle, your father's brother. A collective moan of horror came from the audience. Thorne stared at the screen, at the proof of the lie that had fueled his life's rage, and he visibly shattered. The confident billionaire was gone, replaced by a broken, horrified man. But Elias wasn't finished. The secondary twist, the final piece of the story that he had carried alone his entire life, had to be told. There's one more thing you don't know, Elias said, his voice now quiet, heavy with the weight of memory. You weren't the only one who lost a father because of that fire. He looked out at the silent, captivated audience, at the rolling cameras broadcasting his confession to the world. My father was off duty that night. He heard the sirens from our apartment 6 blocks away. He ran toward the fire, not away from it. The last time I ever saw him, he was running into that burning building, pulling people out. He died on the 3rd-floor landing from smoke inhalation, trying to get to the 5th floor, trying to save your family. The confrontation was complete. It wasn't about business, or revenge, or reputation. It was a reckoning of shared history, of a grief that had been twisted by a lie, and of a truth that had finally been brought into the light. Marcus Thorne, the man who had tried to destroy Elias Vance's legacy, was confronted with the terrible, agonizing truth his entire life's vendetta had been directed at the son of the man who had died a hero trying to save him. On the world's biggest stage, under the glare of 1,000 lights, Marcus Thorne finally, completely, collapsed. The aftermath was swift and absolute. As Marcus Thorne stood catatonic on stage, federal agents, who had been building a case based on the information Elias had been leaking, moved through the panicked crowd. Thorne was quietly and efficiently arrested before the live stream was cut. His empire, built on a foundation of lies both personal and professional, crumbled within days. The falling action of Elias's life was not loud or triumphant. It was a series of quiet, personal moments that were more meaningful than any public victory. He met with his small, loyal team in his studio, now cleared of its war room paraphernalia. There were no grand speeches, just quiet gratitude. He looked at David, Lena, and Sullivan, the 3 people who had stood by him when the world had turned away. I couldn't have done this without you, he said, and the simple words carried the weight of everything they had been through. A few days later, he drove to a small, well-tended cemetery in Queens. He stood before a simple headstone that read, Robert Vance, a good man. The air was cool, the sky a crisp autumn blue. For the first time, Elias spoke to his father not as a boy burdened by a secret shame, but as a man who finally understood the full measure of his legacy. "They know now. Dad," he whispered, placing a hand on the cool granite. "They know you were a hero." A piece he hadn't realized he'd been missing settled over him. A quiet closing of a wound that had been open for 35 years. He met with David, the lone board member who had stood by him, to discuss the future of the foundation. The other board members had resigned in disgrace. "We're going to rebuild it," Elias said, "but not as a tool for reputation, as a genuine force for healing communities, the way it was always supposed to be." Months passed. The world moved on, as it always does. The name Marcus Thorne became a cautionary tale, a footnote in business history. The name Elias Vance, however, became synonymous with integrity and resilience. The resolution was not a celebration of his victory, but a powerful, symbolic act of rebirth. Elias stood on a windswept lot in the South Bronx. The roar of the city, a distant hum. It was the very spot where the old tenement once stood, the place where two families had been shattered by greed and tragedy. Today, it was a construction site, bustling with life and purpose. He was at the groundbreaking ceremony for the new Phoenix Community Center, a state-of-the-art facility with affordable housing, a youth center, and a public library. He stood at a makeshift podium, addressing the small crowd of community leaders, neighborhood residents, and his loyal team. "A building is more than just brick and mortar," he said, his voice carrying over the chilly air. "It's a testament to what we value. It can be a symbol of greed, or it can be a symbol of hope. Today, we choose hope. We build a future from the ashes of the past." Then came the final surprise. "This project, and the new foundation that supports it," Elias announced, "is funded through a unique endowment. We believe in second chances. We believe in breaking cycles of tragedy." He paused, taking a deep breath before delivering the final, quiet revelation. The foundation's first act was to use a portion of the seized assets from Thorne Industries to anonymously fund a full course of experimental medical treatment for a young woman in Switzerland suffering from a rare disease. I'm happy to report that her treatment was successful, and she is now in full recovery. It was the ultimate expression of his character. He had used his restored power not to salt the earth of his vanquished enemy, but to heal the last innocent victim of the tragedy that Thorne had perpetuated. It was an act of profound grace, a quiet, anonymous gesture that defined true strength and empowerment far more than any public revenge ever could. He had not only broken the cycle of revenge, he had redeemed it with an act of compassion. As the crowd applauded, Elias turned and looked at the architectural plans unfurled on a nearby table. They showed a building full of light, a place for learning, for community, for safety, a future built not on a foundation of lies, but on a bedrock of truth and forgiveness.